going to start with some mixed news. I'm going to read from something that was written 20 years ago, and was one of those places where the world could have gone in two different directions. It went in a very bad direction, but you'll see from the quotation. Neither the public nor economists foresaw that savings and loan deregulation in 1982 was bound to produce looting, nor unaware of the concept could they have known how serious it would be. Thus, the regulators in the field who understood what was happening from the beginning found lukewarm support at best for their cause. Now we know better. If we learn from experience, history need not repeat itself. It was written by George Akerlof and Paul Romer. George Akerlof was made a Nobel laureate in economics in 2001. He's one of the most respected economists in the world. Warning people, do not go this route of deregulation. It will produce a disaster. It will produce widespread looting. Here's what they went on to say. Many economists still, again this is in 1993, seem not to understand that a combination of circumstances in the 1980s made it very easy to loot a financial institution with little risk of prosecution. Once this is clear, it becomes obvious that high-risk strategies that would pay off only in some states of the world were only for the timid. Why abuse the system to pursue a gamble that might pay off when you can exploit a sure thing with little risk of prosecution? And that's why the title of their article is Looting the Economic Underworld of Bankruptcy for Profit. So, first good news. The regulators in the field did actually spot the problem immediately. And the big deregulation passed with only one dissenting vote in the House and one dissenting vote in the Senate. So both political parties, and the United States only has two real political parties, were completely aligned on this subject. Within a year, under President Reagan, the federal agency was re-regulating the industry, saying to the president, you're wrong, saying to the Senate, you're wrong, saying to the House of Representatives, you are wrong. And 300 of these fraudulent institutions that were growing at an average rate of 50% a year were dealt with, starting within a year of deregulation. As a result, that crisis cost at least $1 trillion less than if you had done what we did in the current crisis, which is sit back and let it happen. So people can save enormous amounts of money. And they didn't just save enormous amounts of money to the Goldman Sachs of the world. They actually did something. Over 1,000 felony convictions just in cases designated as major. The most successful effort against elite white-collar criminals in history. This can be done, and it can be done even under a president like President Reagan, who was deeply hostile to the effort in many ways. By the way, you already heard about Gregory Mankiw. Well, Gregory Mankiw was the discussant on the Akerlof and Romer paper. So he hears about this fraud, and here's what his response was. He said, quote, it would be irrational for savings and loan CEOs not to loot, unquote. Right, so that's what we're dealing with. An economics at the highest level. Gregory Mankiw was chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, writes the leading textbook in the world in economics, teaches and affects more students than anyone else in economics, and he is someone with a moral development of a 2-year-old, and that's an insult to many 2-year-olds. And he's the top of the profession, right? So this is the type of thing that we need to fight back against. This is why Goldman Sachs is actually such a good example. Not actually because it's the worst of the worst. It's really just like the other systemically dangerous institutions. Yes. In fact, it's much easier to make a case for HSBC to be the worst of the worst, and maybe next year they will be, for all I know. Right? But Goldman Sachs is notorious for a reason. And because Goldman Sachs has that Mankiw morality. And Mankiw morality is, damn right we screwed our customers, and we'll do it again tomorrow. Right? Notice the reaction. Have you seen the ad campaign by competitive rivals saying, leave Goldman Sachs, come to a humane corporation, a humane investment bank that will treat you well? No. They don't even try to differentiate themselves from this kind of approach to the world. So look at the memos and look, we had Senate hearings. You can actually see what happened when Goldman Sachs had to answer questions instead of ducking them the way Shell always tries to do. And so the senators asked them, how could you set up a deal that was designed to fail and encourage your customers to buy the wrong side of the deal? I mean, how can you treat customers like that? And then your memos say, and I quote, that this is a shitty deal, right? It's just terrible, toxic stuff. Whereupon the senior Goldman executive, one of the guys getting that huge bonus that you were talking about, replied that he was very disturbed. He thought it was completely inappropriate to put that in an email. Mankiw morality, right? Again, 2-year-olds get this far better than these people. You have to be really taught to treat people in this kind of abusive fashion. You need an organization that institutionally trains people from the beginning to behave like beasts towards their customers. And so there is a wonderful book, terrible timing, that came out as a celebration of markets called Moral Markets. Right? And it was about how capitalism helps make people more moral. It came out in 2008. Bad time. But in it, it twice says that homo economicus, in other words, people that are trained to behave as economics claims that human beings make economic decisions, is a sociopath. Right? So that's what we teach. And by the way, we have studies, because we're good empiricists, that show that econ students come into our classes being much more selfish than the general population, and they leave our classes being even more selfish. So we do make a world of difference. We make them worse in a traditional economics program. All right, so the work I focus on is, why do we have these recurrent, intensifying financial crises? And what can we do to stop them? Well, I told you about one that we stopped, but if you want the whole US crisis, people think of it still as subprime, but it's actually overwhelmingly liar's loans. And by 2006, half of all the loans called subprime were actually liar's loans as well. What's a liar's loan? A liar's loan is where you don't verify the borrower's income. And studies in America, because again, we have lots more data than other people do, show that 90% of liar's loans are fraudulent. Think about that, 90%. Half of all the things you're called subprime are also liar's loans. So you're loaning to people that have known credit defects, and you're doing it on the basis of a loan application that is false. Is this going to end well? Does anybody have to go to business school to know how this is going to end? Right? This must cause a catastrophe. Everybody knows it must cause a catastrophe, but it makes the officers incredibly rich. That's the title, again, of Akerlof and Romer, looting the economic underworld of bankruptcy for profit. The officers walk away from the toxic waste, very rich. The institution fails, they go on to a very good life as very wealthy people, right? So, what about these liar's loans? How do those lies get in those liar's loans? Well, it turns out, since nobody had a gun to any lender's head, that lenders deliberately chose to make liar's loans. And they deliberately created the incentive structures for the loan brokers to put the lies in the liar's loans. In other words, it was overwhelmingly lenders and their agents who put the lies in the liar's loans. And by 2006, 40% of the total US mortgages made that year were liar's loans. That's over 2 million fraudulent loans made just in 2006, and then sold through fraud to the secondary market. And then the secondary market, through fraud, sold it to everybody else, including people all over the world, Greece, Norway, you name it, right? So this is a massively fraudulent operation involving the most elite financial participants in the world. And they were warned that these were, in writing, repeatedly, that these were overwhelmingly fraudulent loans. They were warned not to make these loans, and they chose to make them because, again, they make the officers rich. Well, could this have been stopped? Well, yeah, actually it was stopped. They did this in 2000 and 2001, and in America, all good frauds start in Orange County, California. So we happened to be the regional regulator for Orange County, California. And our people in the field, remember the Akerlof rumor we're talking about? The guys and gals closest to the facts, not the fancy people in the offices, got it right. And so we just said, yeah, you're right. And we killed it by normal supervisory means. We thought it was one of the easiest decisions we've ever made. And that prevented for a decade that crisis in the United States. But then it was replaced by people who didn't believe in regulation. So let me give you a name in this positive sense. The guy that took on Ronald Reagan, he was a Reagan appointee who loved Ronald Reagan and his wife. His name is Ed Gray, and he knew that when he took them on, he would be made unemployed and unemployable. And he remains, 20 years later, unemployed and unemployable. And he would do the same thing in re-regulating the industry today at the drop of a hat. Because you don't have to avoid mirrors when you walk through the house. Right? So be of good cheer to some extent that this can be changed, but why? Remember Akerlof and Romer say, now we know better. We don't have to go this route. And they give him a Nobel Prize. Everybody in grad school reads that Akerlof article, or at least some of the Akerlof articles, right? And knows these things. Nobody has written the rebuttal saying, oh no, Akerlof is wrong about these things. So why are people ignoring all the criminology literature? By the way, how many people have ever talked to a criminologist for more than 5 seconds in this audience? Yeah, we don't count. Okay. Yeah, okay, so this is kind of interesting, right? We write about fraud all the time. You quote economists who know nothing about fraud. Lawyers who know next to nothing about fraud. You literally, I teach, you spend about 4 days typically in as a law student learning about white-collar crimes out of your 3 years in the United States. So, might want to talk to us. There's actually a whole science, a whole literature, and such, and it's really important to these crises, because these crises are driven by these epidemics of fraud, and they're not random events. They are produced by criminogenic environments, and that's just an environment that is so perverse in its incentive structure that it produces wide-scale fraud. What in particular does that? One, the belief that fraud doesn't exist. Okay? And where do we hear that? Well, we hear that in the effort in 2012 by this group called the World Economic Forum in its report on rethinking financial innovation, something that indicates very little rethinking went on. 6.1.1, consumer disservice. There's a euphemism. Malfeasance and outright fraud in finance are extraordinarily damaging, but also, fortunately, extremely rare. No citations, no numbers, okay? More than 2 million fraudulent loans in 2006 alone. Hey, but maybe that's just the United States, where 40% of the loans were liar's loans. How about England? How many of the loans, home mortgage loans there? Anybody? No? 45%. Puts a whole different spin on the UK crisis, doesn't it? Ireland, front to back, same kind of frauds. Iceland, different fraud scheme, but front to back frauds in all of this. Spain looks the same pattern, but they keep it so opaque that we don't know the underlying facts. So a goodly portion of the crisis we're dealing with is due to these kinds of frauds, but we have huge fraud deniers. I told you about the savings and loan crisis. The National Commission there reported at the typical large failure, fraud was invariably present. Enron era, those were all frauds emanating from the C-suite as well. But we get to this crisis, and guess what? The World Economic Forum tells us it's the first virgin crisis, conceived without any sin and such. And who believed this kind of fairy tale? Well, it turns out a guy in a rather powerful position. Here is Brooksley Born's account of her first meeting with Alan Greenspan. Brooksley Born was the chair of the Commodities Future Trading Commission and one of the people who tried to do the right thing and got squashed for doing it. And she's quoting Greenspan. Well, Brooksley, I guess you and I will never agree about fraud. Born, what is there not to agree about fraud? Well, you probably will always believe that there should be laws against fraud. And I don't think there is any need for a law against fraud, she recalls Greenspan. He believed the markets would take care of it themselves without any law. And if that seems crazy, the leading law and economics textbook, so it isn't just the econ texts, the leading law and econ text, which is a big deal in many countries, says the following, and a generation of American lawyers have been taught that this is a fact. A rule against fraud is not an essential or even a particularly important ingredient of securities markets. Because fraud just can't happen, right? Now, if you believe this insanity, you do things like ignore liar's loans, which is exactly what Alan Greenspan did. So Alan Greenspan has said, mea culpa, I was wrong about this, that it was actually fraud. The World Economic Forum, writing in 2012, says fraud virtually does not exist in finance. And therefore, it has nothing meaningful in its so-called competitiveness index to even measure this problem. And therefore, they get things as wrong as it is conceivable to get something wrong. So look at their lists in 2006 and 2007 of the top-rated nations in soundness of banking. Oh, it's going to have Ireland. Iceland's, only about 19, but Ireland's number 3. Third best system in the world for soundness of banking in 2006, and it goes all the way up to only 5th best in the world in 2007, 2008. England is number 1. United Kingdom is number 1 in the world, right? These are places that at the time they were doing this were massively insolvent. Virtually every large bank. in all of these countries was already insolvent and had been insolvent for years. And the World Economic Forum, with their surveys of CEOs, can't even get, guess where Ireland is now in their survey? 144 out of 144, right? If they can't get finance, which they live with, these guys in finance all the time, if they can't get that the worst banking system in the world, and they're claiming it's the third best banking system in the world, then it becomes clear that this survey stuff is just a bunch of business dogma and prejudices wrapped up by collating many businesses' prejudices and calling it science. And it is simply junk empiricism, and it needs to end. Two other areas that make things criminogenic. One, deregulation. I talked about that. The Akerlof and Romer, the deregulation, desupervision was bound to produce wide-scale looting. What does the World Economic Forum push in its competitive index relentlessly? Deregulation. And what is the dynamic that most destructively drives deregulation? It's the international competition, the race to the bottom that the City of London won. And therefore, it's no surprise that scandal after scandal starts in the City of London. It's not unique to the City of London, but the City of London is the cesspool of finance because of this competition. And what is the competitive index supposed to do? What do they encourage? Its use. It's to drive precisely that competition, the race to the bottom. Hey, improve your competitiveness, gut your regulations. What's the third area that is so criminogenic? The third area is modern executive compensation and professional compensation. The executive you've heard a lot about, right? In fact, you've heard some today. We give you an incentive structure to make bad loans. You'll make bad loans in abundance, and you will become very wealthy. And again, the institution may fail, but you will walk away wealthy. Or you may commit frauds that make money for the firm. This is part of what my colleague began the discussion with. And Goldman Sachs did both kinds. Right? There were individual officers that looted Goldman Sachs, and there was a broader Goldman Sachs enterprise that looted customers. Turns out they stole more from the customers than the officers were stealing from Goldman Sachs, so Goldman Sachs is profitable net, right? But it's always a creative tension within a place like Goldman Sachs. Which of these forms of fraud is going to predominate? And by the way, that's why there is no Merrill Lynch, at least no independent Merrill Lynch. That's why there is no Bear Stearns. That's why there is no Lehman Brothers. Because these people are so predacious, they are so infused with Mankiw morality that they would be happy to loot their firm 6 ways from Sunday. And they frequently do it to an extraordinary detail. The one that gets less understanding is what we call a Gresham's dynamic. And this has often to do with professional compensation. And this is another major problem. Both of these are major problems with the competitiveness index of the World Economic Forum. They say pay competitiveness is one of their key indices for good, right? So you're bad unless you have performance pay. But performance pay doesn't produce performance, it produces looting and other rapacious behavior. So that's an area. But they also want to, for example, World Economic Forum has all kinds of indices that look at governance, supposedly, look at auditing and such. And if you read their stuff, they say, this is great because it prevents fraud. So first simple question, where did it exactly do that? Where are the success stories of governance? Where are the success stories of audit in this crisis? You're journalists, you cover lots of things. I go all over the world doing this here stuff and spend my life. There are virtually no success stories. And the reason is the Gresham's dynamic. A control fraud, it's the people in control of the organization. This is the C-suite using a seemingly legitimate organization as a weapon. In finance, the weapon of choice is accounting. So I want to get the outside auditor. I don't want to defeat an external control like an outside auditor. I want to suborn him or her and make them an ally. I want to use their reputation when they give me the clean opinion to aid my fraud. And the record shows that they are incredibly successful. There's a recent OECD study that says that governance and audit was an abject failure throughout Europe. It was the same in the United States. I'm not picking on Europe in this context. And it's worse in China. I'll leave you with this. I've been talking about money, and money's important because these frauds are so large that they hyperinflate the financial bubbles, and they drive these economic crises that cost, this most recent crisis has cost over $20 trillion in wealth. That's all. People cannot figure out what a trillion is. I've done it with students lots of times. It's immense. And it's cost 20 million people their jobs. And many people their lives, as you just heard, as well. That's money. Let me leave you with this same dynamic, this Gresham's dynamic, where if you gain a competitive advantage, this is what we've started the discussion with, by cheating, then you drive honest competitors out of the marketplace. Right? And that can mean money, but it can mean money and many worse things. It's one of the leading causes of environmental destruction in the world, but I'll leave you simply with the Chinese infant formula scandal. It's cheaper not to put milk in formula for infants. It's cheaper to just put water and, in essence, chalk. China has seen this fraud many times, so it adopted a screening system that looked for protein levels. And so the manufacturers added a protein to spoof the test. This protein causes kidney stones to develop in kids as young as 2 months old. Killed 4 to 5 kids, but hospitalized 300,000. The highest restraint that we have as human beings, species-wise, is harming infants. It's incredibly difficult to get people to harm infants. People were willing to kill thousands of infants. They didn't succeed, but they're quite willing to do it for a food why. That's how bad the system is. That's why the World Economic Forum is a leading cause of making the world more criminogenic and degrading the state of life instead of adding to it. And so it's fitting that we give this presentation here at the World Economic Forum and ask them to change and clean up their act, because if they are the enablers for the Goldman Sachs of the world. Thank you.